it's just possible that you haven't spent much time thinking about sponges. You've been missing out. Sponges include predators, things that crawl around on the seafloor, and the longest-lived animals or organisms of any sort on the planet that we know of. So, here's the basics, and from then we'll get on to the interesting stuff. People sometimes ask me why I ended up studying sponges. And aside from the fact that they're obviously easier to look after than parrots, and everyone's got to do something, right? Aside from that, there's, I guess, a true answer and an inspiring answer. And the inspiring one is that sponges are absolutely incredible. They are absolutely vital to our understanding of the origin of animals, where we all came from, and yet at the same time they are highly specialised, highly derived creatures that have adapted to a way of living that is quite alien to things that walk around like we do. So there's an awful lot to understand about these things, and it turns out that there was an awful lot that we didn't know when I first started looking at them when it comes to the fossil record. The true answer, though, because I didn't know all that at the time, is that I started finding fossils of them when I was a young undergraduate student, in fact, and then PhD student, even more of them. And I couldn't get anyone to do them for me. So I had to do them myself. And then it was a bit of a slippery slope, and I ended up doing them forevermore. Luckily, I do get to do other things as well, but still, it's a lot of sponges in my life. And I think it's time that you had some too. So to start with the basics, what are sponges? Sponges are a phylum, one of these major divisions of animal life. There's a video on taxonomy if you want to know more about that one. But a phylum is the largest major group of animals that shares the same sort of body plan. So when you see these two things, there's not immediately a close similarity between them, and yet these are both sponges. They both work in the same fundamental way, and they both share the same type of structure to allow them to function. They just have different skeletons. So this is probably the most familiar type of sponge to most people. It's a bath sponge, and it shows quite neatly the basic sort of form of them and how they actually work. Because you'll notice if you look at the top view, there are quite a lot of large holes. These quite big spaces. It's difficult seeing these in the camera. There we go. These little pores that act as chimneys, effectively. And they do act as chimneys because water is pumped out through those pores. The water gets there through all the much, much tinier pores in the sides of the sponge. So you can see all this sort of very spongy texture. And this is just in the skeleton. The outside will be covered with soft tissue as well, and that has even tinier pores, down to about 1/10, 1/20th of a millimetre wide, through which water is sucked in through all sides and pumped out through these holes at the top. And that water, which they're pumping through themselves, is then filtered by the same cells, called choanocytes, that actually create the current in the first place. So they're basically little cells lining all the internal cavities with a little flagellum on it that beats in the same direction, pulling water through the outsides of the sponge and up through these larger and larger canals going out to the even bigger canals in the centre, which eventually expel the water upwards. And you can see this with dye. If you have a live sponge, you put dye in the water and you can watch it being sucked in and then jetted out the top at a really quite surprising speed. So those cells, the choanocytes that are creating the currents, also have a little collar of cilia around the base of them, which can filter the water of any yummy organic material, decaying bits of matter, bacteria, anything small enough to go through the filtration system and large enough to catch. And that is their food supply. The sponge then digests these bits of organic material on a cellular basis. They don't have a digestive system, they don't have a stomach. Each bit is digested by the cell that catches it, and the nutrition is shared across the whole sponge. And that is how almost every sponge exists, effectively. There are exceptions. I mentioned there are predatory sponges, and these ones are actually quite highly specialised in that they have lost the entire water filtration system in some cases. There are some that do a bit of filtering and others that are entirely dependent on catching things like shrimps and even fish in some cases, and then digesting them. And they do that by modifying their skeleton, we'll come to the skeleton in a bit, into little hooks that tangle things until they can't get away. And then, like something out of a slow-motion horror movie, they just grow themselves over this entangled creature and digest it one cell at a time, which is probably not a lovely way to go, but I've actually seen it happen as well. So I've been lucky enough to be shown an aquarium in Marseille kept by the amazing Jean Vasselet, who discovered these predatory sponges in a cave in the Mediterranean, and has been keeping them for decades, looking after them, watching them, studying them. And I was happy to be there at feeding time, so he takes these sea monkeys, which you probably familiar sort of childhood toy, effectively. You get eggs, you can hatch them, and you get these tiny little shrimps that start swimming around in your water. And he then drops them into the tank, and they swim around a bit until one of them accidentally brushes against a sponge and gets slightly stuck. And we didn't stay for the whole show because it would have taken a few days to actually absorb the thing. But yeah, apparently if you stay there for long enough, you can see them being enveloped and digested. Yeah. It's not quite lions in the Serengeti, but, you know, nearly as wild. Now, one big difference between these two that I showed you earlier is that this one has lots and lots of exhalant holes, these chimneys, effectively, what we call oscula. This one has only one. This is a different group of sponges. I'll come on to the classification shortly. But this one has a single vase-like form with, actually it's got a sort of a porous plate over the top, which you can probably barely see. There you go. And this one has just a single osculum at the top. And there's actually a big debate over whether sponges are technically colonial, or clonal, or compound, or even solitary. And one way of looking at it, there is no consensus. We tried to get a paper published on this a few years ago, and there just wasn't enough consensus to get any agreement on it. But there is one school of thought that you can define an individual sponge as a single inhalant-exhalant system. So one of these chimneys is supplied by an array of inhalant pores around the side, which all eventually feed into the one chamber in the centre that then expels the water out there. So this would then be a colony, a highly integrated colony, where all of the individuals are basically so integrated that they have become a superorganism, rather than lots of separate things living together. And on that basis, then this would be a solitary sponge animal. And I actually quite like this definition. I think it makes a lot of sense in biological terms and on evolutionary terms. So that's the one I'm going to use, but be aware that there are all sorts of arguments about the terminology and the semantics and exactly what we mean by coloniality. Right, if you're going to sit on the seabed, pumping water through yourself, then you need something to hold yourself upright. Otherwise, you just sort of go because pressure differences. You need a skeleton. You need something to actually give yourself a form and to maintain that form. And there are various ways that sponges make skeletons. There are actually quite a few different versions. So this familiar one, the bath sponge, is a skeleton made of organic material only, called spongin. There may well be chitin involved in some, it's sort of collagen-like substances, but it's organic material which does rot away. It doesn't leave much of a fossil record, although there is debate over that one. I'm sure I'll talk about that at some point. And yes, but this is strong enough to maintain the form of the sponge and allow this filtration to keep going. Other sponges use a skeleton made of biominerals. And there are two minerals that they use, well, three technically, but this one is the dominant group in 3 out of the 4 classes of sponges, and it is opal. That's right, a gemstone. It is hydrated silicon dioxide. It's not quite a crystal, it's a sort of quasi-crystal. It doesn't have the regular structure on very small distance scales, but it is actually a mineral. And this is something that is secreted by the cells of the sponge onto a little organic template, and it builds up a network of little, what we call spicules, elements of the skeleton, that combine together to create this wonderful, rather beautiful network, which is then the skeleton that holds the sponge intact. Now, I could crush this between my fingers with virtually no effort at all, and I can take some of the individual hairs that you can just see projecting off the side and tie knots in them. It's flexible but very delicate. And most sponges actually use a skeleton made out of spicules of silica. There is one class that uses spicules instead made of calcite, a different mineral which is much more familiar from the shells of oysters and brachiopods and bryozoans and all sorts of things that secrete a calcium carbonate skeleton. And this is just as delicate. It's made of spicules again, and as you'll see in a minute, they're actually really tiny things, these calcarean sponges. There is another type of skeleton that has been evolved multiple times across at least 2 of the classes, and this is what we call hypercalcified. It basically turns itself into a rock by secreting such massive amounts of calcium carbonate that it becomes a solid structure with pores running through it. And these things make reefs. They're very abundant in much of the fossil record at different times, and they are effectively fossils the moment they're formed. They are made of aragonite or calcite, forms of calcium carbonate, secreted en masse to create a very large solid structure. Are there any that don't have any skeleton at all? Well, yes, there are. There are 2 groups, small groups, one called the homoscleromorphs, or part of them, and there are some demosponges that also have no skeleton whatsoever. And they manage this by having a lifestyle which is encrusting onto surfaces. So onto rocky surfaces, they have almost no thickness. They just got this gelatinous body with pores running through it, canals running through it, and they have so little form to them. They're just a mat with pores going through, that they don't need a skeleton to survive. Everything else has to have some sort of skeleton in order to actually maintain its body form. So, as I said, there are 4 main classes. These are the major subdivisions of sponges alive today, and some extinct ones, but 4 classes alive today. The most abundant and diverse by far, constituting something like 85% of known species of sponges alive today, are the demosponges. Demos means common, and not only are they extremely diverse, they are also very highly adapted, particularly to shallow water environments. So if you go looking for sponges around a modern seashore, you're almost certainly going to see a preponderance of demosponges. If you've got really good eyes, you might find a calcarean, and if you're lucky, you might find a homoscleromorph. But almost all of them are going to be demosponges. These have usually some organic component to their skeleton. In some cases like this, it's the entirety of the skeleton. Usually, or a large number of them also have spicules made of opal. These are very small, either single rayed spicules, what we call monaxons, single axis, or tetraxons, which have 4 axes. So sort of in a tetrahedral type arrangement, like that. Yeah, something like that. And most demosponges are also compound. They're colonial, they have multiple osculi, and they are amorphous. They are adapted to this life in turbulent, shallow environments, encrusting onto irregular surfaces, and so they tend not to have a consistent form. This is important. This is an adaptation to these conditions. It is not necessarily what they started out as. Because they live in such turbulent conditions for the most part, and because their skeletons are made of these tiny little spicules that in most cases are not rigidly interlocked, they're just loose, so that when the sponge dies and decays it just scatters and falls apart, what you end up with is a very poor fossil record. There is one group called the lithistids which does produce a really rigidly interlocking skeleton, and those have a good fossil record. There are some that have hypercalcified skeletons, and those have a good record. But the majority of demosponges are virtually invisible to the fossil record because they just disintegrate and disappear. Okay, the sister group to demosponges, their next closest relatives, and this is supported by all the genetic data that we have, as well as morphological ones, are actually the glass sponges, the hexactinellids. These are defined today on the basis of possessing a particular type of spicule, which is called a hexactin. This is, as you might expect, 6-rayed. So it's like a three-dimensional cross with rays going everywhere, and lots of variations on that as well. But they have built this skeleton, including this regular grid structure, out of hexactins and modified versions of them. And there's a lot of diversity within the hexactinellids, but unlike demosponges, they are restricted almost entirely to cold, deep water. Mostly they are found in the bathyal zone, so way off the edge of the continental shelf, down onto the slope, and into the abyssal plain. There are a few exceptions. There's a cave, another one found by Jean Vasselet, in the Mediterranean, where you have very cold water and there's a population of one species there. And under the ice in the Antarctic shelf, for example, you get some others, and a few fjords off British Columbia. So you do get a few in shallow water, but mostly this is a deep water group. They are never seen by casual snorkelers, anyone visiting the seashore, and yet they are an absolutely fascinating group of organisms. Some of these are the longest lived organisms that we know of. And I will probably do a separate video on that because it's just extraordinary, but there are some of these glass sponges in the deep sea alive today that appear to have seen the end of the last ice age. It's not bad going. There aren't any trees that can do that. Their fossil record is very mixed, because there are some hexactinellids that have a fused skeleton, and that actually preserves really well, or has done at certain times. So in the Cretaceous, during the chalk seas at the time of the last dinosaurs, apart from birds, we have a really rich record of hexactinellid sponges. Before that, though, when they were restricted again to the deep oceans, the Cretaceous was a time of very high sea level, so they colonised what are now the continents, continental shelves. In the deep oceans, we have very little even sedimentary rock record because it all gets subducted, it all gets destroyed by continental collisions and returned back into the mantle and subduction zone. So we don't see much of the deep ocean record of sponges. And we're now turning up these things in the Ordovician, and so we do have an extremely long record. Again, it's something I'll do more of a video about at some point. Brief interlude. Those who know a little bit about this subject might be saying, but hang on, there are masses of hexactinellids in the Paleozoic. And the answer to that is, no, there probably aren't. This thing here is not necessarily anything to do with hexactinellids at all, but we'll come on to that in a future one. Okay, the last two classes of living sponges are virtually unknown as fossils, Just a few very scattered examples. One is the calcarea. These are relatively easy to find today, washed up on strand lines around the coasts of Britain and the world. And even if you're lucky at low tide, you'll find some in little damp corners, in rock pools and so on. And these are mostly very, very small sponges. The majority are less than a centimetre. You very rarely see one bigger than that, at least in this part of the world. And their skeleton is made of minute spicules of calcite. These are, which is why they're called calcarea. They also contain some of the simplest body forms. Many of them are solitary, some are branched, so you clearly have coloniality there, where each branch has an osculum at the end, and there's some more encrusting multi-oscular ones as well. So they're quite diverse form and structure, but they're an absolute taxonomic minefield, which is why hardly anyone studies them. They're nearly as bad, in fact, as the fourth class, which wasn't even recognised as a class until 2012. They'd previously been lumped in with demospongiae until genetics kept telling us that they were not only different, but more closely related to calcareans. Go figure. They have silica spicules, at least some of them do. The ones that have spicules at all have silica spicules. Some of them don't have any skeleton whatsoever. You find them encrusting rock surfaces, often in caves for some reason, sea caves. And they are very difficult to work on. They're amorphous. They have a strange internal structure that is very difficult to study. There's not much consistency to them. And the spicules, when they have them, are tiny. And because of this environment that they live in, which is a zone of turbulence and erosion, again, we tend not to find any record of these in the fossil record. If you're lucky, and there are, I think, some going back to the Carboniferous, there are isolated spicules that are distinctive. The spicules that they have are more of these tetractiny things, 4 rays and going off at different angles, and quite similar to some demosponges, but the detailed structure of them, the microstructure, is a little different. This is just a first introduction to the sponges, so I don't want this to go on for too long. But there are a few major questions that I am going to be focusing on in future videos, and just want to raise for now. So the first thing is, we know the arrangement of these sponges in terms of their genetics. We know which groups are most closely related to which. We know the topology of the evolutionary tree. What we don't know so much is what the last common ancestors of the various groups look like. And this is where there's been a lot of debate and there are a lot of assumptions. So, for example, there is a lot of discussion over whether each class developed its skeleton independently of the other classes, or whether they are actually shared and they've evolved from one group to another. There is also a lot of discussion about how far back sponges go in time, because predictions based on their position in the animal hierarchy, that they are somewhere near the very base of animals. They're one of the first branches, maybe the second after ctenophores. Predictions based on that and on molecular clocks predict that we should have sponges way back in the Precambrian, before most other animal groups evolved. And yet, despite the fact they have a skeleton, at least the modern classes do, there's no clear record of them in the Ediacaran at all. So this discrepancy between the fossil record and what we would expect to see is a major part of sponge research. There's also the question of, we know that sponges are highly adapted to particular conditions, and particularly that our friendly little colonial ones are extremely modified compared with other types of sponges and the ancestral forms of these. So how far does that modification go? Is it actually simplification from a much more complex ancestor? What were the original ancestors of sponges like? Were they anything that we would even recognise as a sponge? Or is this entire sponge-like body plan where they filter water through themselves an adaptation of this lineage, which is a derived feature? there are these questions which have always been assumed before, that they used to have a place at the base of animal evolution, basically a sort of a biofilm of protists that became colonial and started filtering water, and that was the first animal. We now know that isn't quite true, but how simple were the first sponges, or were they actually much more like other animals? There are all sorts of lines of evidence now being developed from genetics and morphology, from paleontology, which are making us rethink the entire ancestry of sponges and what they tell us about early animal evolution. So it's a wonderful group to study, and I will be talking a lot more about sponges every now and then, because, yeah, you've got a captive audience here, why should I waste it? And so I'll leave it there for now. But hopefully that gives you a sort of primer in what sponges are, how they work, and what features we're going to be looking at when we're studying the fossil record in detail. So thank you for listening. I hope that's useful for those who needed the background. And hopefully you're looking forward to the next instalment where we get to the detailed bits of it. Right. See you again.